All right, here's section 4 and its focus question. Outnumbered by whites and facing federal, state, and local authorities dedicated to preserving slavery, enslaved people only rarely rebelled. Compared to Caribbean or Latin American slavery, where enslaved people were more numerous and more often imported directly from Africa, slave rebellions in the United States were smaller and less frequent. This does not mean that enslaved people simply submitted to their condition. Resistance to slavery took many forms, from individual acts of disobedience to the occasional uprising. The most common form of slave opposition was day to day resistance or silent sabotage, doing poor work, breaking tools, abusing animals, and simply disrupting plantation routine. Enslaved people faked illness or found other ways to avoid reporting to work. Many enslaved people stole food, but less frequent and more dangerous were assaults against whites, from arson and poisoning to armed attacks. Escape was a serious threat to slavery's stability. Most enslaved people who ran away would leave the plantation for a day or two simply to frustrate owners, but would return. The smaller number of fugitive slaves who attempted to permanently escape faced considerable obstacles to freedom. They often had little or no knowledge of geography beyond the plantation, other than to know that the North meant freedom. Perhaps 1,000 enslaved people reached the North or Canada each year. Most fugitive slaves escaped from Upper South states where they could more easily reach the North. In the Deep South, fugitive slaves often went to cities where they could blend in with free black communities. A loose organization of sympathetic black and white abolitionists called the Underground Railroad helped enslaved people run away. A few courageous individuals, such as Harriet Tubman, made forays into the South to liberate enslaved people and guide them to freedom. Most enslaved people who managed to escape, however, did so of their own initiative, often showing remarkable ingenuity. Rather than a rigid system, the Underground Railroad was a series of interlocking local networks involving black and white abolitionists. These networks communicated with one another and assisted a substantial number of fugitives, estimated at 30,000 in the 3 decades before the Civil War, to escape to the North and Canada. While the numbers were not enough to undermine the entire system of slavery, the Underground Railroad and escapes became a major source of consternation in slave states. By the 1850s, enslaved people were using numerous means of escape, not simply fleeing on foot, but by boats run by sympathetic crews, taking owners' horses and carriages, and boarding trains. Driven by multiple motives connected to freedom, their actions profoundly impacted national politics. Runaways undermined the Southern narrative of the contented slave, and fugitives became a major irritant in diplomatic affairs when other countries, such as Mexico and Canada, refused to return escaped slaves. Efforts to recapture enslaved people escaped to the North, however, demonstrated that the peculiar institution extended its power into free states as well. Many Northerners who were not abolitionists were forced to confront the question of the relationship between individual conscience and obedience to laws, requiring their cooperation in returning runaway slaves. In a few cases, large groups of rebellious enslaved people gained their freedom. The most famous case involved the enslaved people aboard the Amistad, a slave ship off the coast of Cuba in 1839. After they seized the ship, the enslaved people sailed the ship up the American coast until it was seized. While President Martin Van Buren wanted to return the enslaved people to Cuba, abolitionists helped the enslaved people sue for freedom. And in the Supreme Court, former President John Quincy Adams defended them. Adams argued that since the enslaved people had been brought from Africa in violation of international treaties banning the slave trade, they should be freed. The court agreed, and most of the freed slaves emigrated back to Africa. While the Amistad case had no legal bearing on enslaved people in the United States, it may have inspired later revolts on slave ships such as the Creole, which eventually found refuge in the British Bahamas. Enslaved people only rarely mounted organized rebellions within the United States. The four largest conspiracies in American history happened between 1800 and 1831. Gabriel's Rebellion in 1800 was followed in 1811 by an uprising on sugar plantations in Louisiana, in which several hundred armed enslaved people who tried to march on New Orleans were defeated in a bloody encounter with militia and federal troops. In 1822, Denmark Vesey, an enslaved carpenter in Charleston, South Carolina, organized a rebellion. He quoted the Bible and the Declaration of Independence to justify armed resistance. His plot was discovered before it was implemented, and Vesey and 34 other blacks were executed. Much of the evidence for slave conspiracies is contradictory and disputed because trials were conducted in secret, and the accused were forbidden from confronting those who testified against them. The best known enslaved rebel was Nat Turner, an enslaved preacher and mystic in Virginia who believed that God had appointed him to lead a black rebellion. Though he initially chose to launch his uprising on July 4th, 1831, it was delayed until August, when he led a handful of followers from farm to farm, killing white families along the way. After killing dozens of whites, Turner and his followers were captured and executed. Nat Turner's rebellion shocked the South and caused owners throughout the region to punish and execute recalcitrant or suspect slaves. In the aftermath, Virginia's legislature passed harsh laws further restricting enslaved people and the rights of free blacks. Other southern states followed suit. The rebellion also inspired a growing movement of abolitionists in the North to demand the immediate abolition of slavery, sparking a reaction in the South against abolition and civil liberties that would intensify sectional hostility. In some ways, 1831 marked a turning point in the Old South. That year, the British Parliament launched a program for abolition in the Empire, which underscored the growing isolation of slavery in the South. William Lloyd Garrison, ardent abolitionist, argued that slavery faced enemies from within and from outside the South. The pro-slavery argument increasingly permeated Southern society, and abolitionists and their ideas were increasingly unwelcome, with some facing violence. As reform movements in the North more frequently and assertively condemned slavery, the South closed in defense of the institution. And that is the end of section 4, and we'll see you next time.